Dr. William Carter was a man of reputation. He was the top cardiac surgeon in the city of Atlanta and was known for his exceptional skill in the operating room. But there was another reputation he had earned in the halls of Grace Medical Center, and it wasn't one that made him particularly proud. He was known for his arrogance. Dr. Carter was a tall, middle-aged man, with a square jaw and graying hair that he wore as a badge of experience. His pristine white coat seemed to shine brighter than the rest, as though he demanded his superiority be reflected in the smallest of things. It was a Tuesday afternoon when a nurse knocked lightly on Dr. Carter's office door. He barely glanced up from his computer screen when she spoke. "Dr. Carter, there's a new patient in exam room 3, Nurse Jessica began. "She's in severe pain and—" "Is Dr. Lambert not available?" Dr. Carter cut her off, his voice sharp. "She requested you specifically, sir," Nurse Jessica replied, with a hint of hesitation. "She seems to be an emergency case." Dr. Carter took a sip of his coffee, barely masking his irritation. He wasn't a doctor who liked to be disturbed from his administrative duties unless the case warranted his attention. He placed his cup down and narrowed his eyes at the nurse. "Who is she?" he asked. Jessica's eyes fluttered momentarily as she referred to the chart. "Her name is Helen," she replied. "Helen Daniels." Dr. Carter's face remained indifferent. "And her symptoms?" "She's experiencing severe chest pains," Jessica continued. "Her blood pressure is—" "Jessica," Dr. Carter interrupted, letting out a frustrated sigh. "I don't need the whole textbook description. What is the main issue?" "She might be having a heart attack," Jessica responded, more firmly now. "Fine," he grumbled, pushing his chair back as if the action itself required great effort. He stood up, straightened his coat, and started toward the exam rooms. As he walked down the hall, his eyes darted towards room 3. He'd seen countless patients in his career, but this time, as he approached, he noticed a small, unfamiliar crowd near the room. Other nurses stood with concerned looks on their faces, whispering to each other. Dr. Carter reached for the door and entered without a knock. He found a woman in her late 30s, sitting on the examination table, her skin glistening with perspiration. She looked up as he entered, pain evident in her eyes. Her hand was pressed against her chest, and she was breathing heavily. There was something familiar about her face, but he couldn't quite place it. Her expression shifted slightly as she saw him, a mix of hope and anxiety. "Helen Daniels?" he asked, holding her chart in his hand, eyes scanning her details. "Yes," she gasped. "All right, let's get this over with quickly," Dr. Carter said, his voice brisk. "Can you describe the pain?" Helen struggled to speak between breaths. "It's sharp, like pressure." Dr. Carter nodded impatiently. "How long have you been experiencing this?" "About an hour, but it's getting worse," she said, her voice faltering. As he continued asking routine questions, Dr. Carter's mind was half-focused. He had several other things to attend to that day, and this woman's case didn't seem to be particularly noteworthy. But something was nagging at him. Something in the back of his mind was telling him he'd seen this woman's face before. He pushed the thought aside and began a preliminary examination, his demeanor detached and businesslike. Dr. Carter concluded the examination with practiced efficiency. He'd already made up his mind. This case was routine, nothing to disrupt his day for. Helen, still struggling to maintain her composure through the pain, tried to speak again. "Doctor, is it serious?" she asked, her voice almost pleading. Dr. Carter barely looked at her. "Ms. Daniels, I believe you may have a case of severe anxiety. We'll run some tests, but from what I've seen so far, it doesn't seem critical," he replied, his tone dismissive. Helen's eyes widened in disbelief. "But it feels so." "People often mistake anxiety attacks for cardiac events," Dr. Carter interjected, a slight condescension creeping into his voice. He didn't offer any further reassurance or explanation. Instead, he made some notes in her chart and turned toward the door, ready to move on to the next task. "Doctor, wait," Helen called after him, her voice a little stronger this time, a hint of desperation there. "Please." But Dr. Carter didn't respond. He turned the handle and left the room without another word. He couldn't help but feel a slight annoyance at the persistence of some patients. After all, he was the expert here. As he walked back to his office, Nurse Jessica intercepted him in the hallway. "Dr. Carter, the patient in room 3. "I've already seen her," Dr. Carter interrupted, his impatience obvious. "It's likely a case of anxiety. Run the standard blood tests and discharge her when possible." Jessica's face tightened. "But, sir, she's—" "Nurse Jessica, I know what I'm doing," he said firmly, his eyes narrowing as if daring her to contradict him. Jessica held his gaze for a moment, but then lowered her eyes. "Yes, doctor," she muttered and walked away. Dr. Carter returned to his office, feeling a sense of relief. The sooner he could finish his paperwork, the sooner he could move on to the evening's planned dinner with hospital benefactors. He barely noticed the small voice in his head that was telling him he'd overlooked something. Several hours passed, and Dr. Carter received an urgent call from the ER. Nurse Jessica's voice was on the other end, but it was shaking now. "Dr. Carter, you need to come down here. Ms. Daniels has gone into cardiac arrest." "What?" Dr. Carter's stomach dropped slightly. "I thought she was just having an anxiety attack." "No, doctor," Jessica replied, her voice firm. "It wasn't just anxiety." Dr. Carter rushed to the ER, his mind racing. When he arrived, he saw a flurry of activity. Helen was on a stretcher, surrounded by medical staff performing chest compressions. Her face was pale, her eyes closed. Dr. Carter's heart sank. He hadn't seen it coming. And that's when the recognition hit him like a tidal wave. He knew Helen Daniels. And he knew exactly who she was. But it was too late to take back his arrogance or his judgment. Dr. Carter stood motionless, watching the scene unfold. For the first time in years, he felt a chill of fear in his veins. His pulse quickened as the emergency room staff worked frantically to stabilize Helen. She was in full cardiac arrest, and he wasn't the one leading the charge, something almost unheard of for a man in his position. A sense of helplessness enveloped him as he realized that, for all his medical expertise and arrogance, he had missed something crucial. "Get the crash cart over here," one of the nurses yelled, her voice sharp and commanding. Another nurse rushed in with a defibrillator, and the doctors around Helen began calling out vitals and administering medications. Dr. Carter's mind was still racing. It wasn't the procedure that unnerved him. He'd seen and performed resuscitations countless times before. It was the nagging voice in his head telling him that he knew this woman. Not just her face, but her name too. Helen Daniels, he muttered to himself, trying to make sense of the recognition that had evaded him earlier. His thoughts traveled back in time, grasping for a connection. Then it hit him. Helen Daniels wasn't just another patient. Years ago, he had read her name in a national magazine, on a special edition cover that celebrated her achievement. Helen Daniels was a renowned civil rights attorney, a fighter for the marginalized and forgotten. She had taken on some of the toughest racial discrimination cases in the city and had won them, one after another. In some circles, she was a hero. And Dr. Carter, in his insulated world of medical accolades and professional rivalry, had dismissed her as just another black woman with a routine complaint. The realization stung. Dr. Carter's eyes darted toward the team, their efforts intensifying as they attempted to revive her. It was an odd experience for him, standing on the sidelines and seeing his colleagues work, wondering if his own prejudices had prevented him from doing his job properly. He should have been in there with them, leading the response. But now, all he could do was watch. The piercing sound of a flatline echoed through the room. A tense silence followed as the staff exchanged glances. They pushed forward, not ready to give up. Dr. Carter felt his breath catch in his throat, and without thinking, he moved closer to the bed. He found his voice. "Clear," he called out, but his tone lacked the confidence he usually commanded. The defibrillator pads were placed on Helen's chest, and a jolt was sent through her body. Dr. Carter silently willed her heart to start beating again. Another jolt. Nothing. Another. Still nothing. For a brief moment, Dr. Carter considered stepping in and taking charge, but something held him back, perhaps his shaken confidence, or maybe the memory of his callous dismissal just hours earlier. After what felt like an eternity, one of the attending physicians turned to Dr. Carter with a grim look on his face. "Doctor, she's not responding." A wave of guilt crashed over him, heavier than any he had ever felt. Dr. Carter closed his eyes and let out a shaky breath. "Call it," he heard someone say. The time of death was recorded, and the team slowly began to step away from the bed, their faces solemn. Dr. Carter stood there, frozen, staring at Helen's still form. It was only later that the whispers began to circulate through the hospital staff, whispers about the doctor who had refused to take the patient seriously, and the lawyer whose life had ended too soon. The day after Helen's death, the atmosphere in Grace Medical Center was heavy with unspoken words and sideways glances. The nurses and doctors who had been present during the incident seemed to avoid Dr. Carter's gaze. The staff was professional enough to carry out their duties, but it was clear that the events of the previous day weighed on their minds. Dr. Carter tried to focus on his work, burying himself in patient charts and medical records, but his concentration was shattered. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Helen's face. He heard her pleading voice, felt the weight of his indifferent response, and saw the lifeless body on the stretcher. The events had left an indelible mark on his conscience. By mid-morning, the hospital administration had heard of the incident, and an emergency meeting was called. Dr. Carter entered the boardroom, where several senior hospital administrators sat around the table. The chief of staff, Dr. Randall, was a seasoned physician with a stern demeanor and a reputation for enforcing hospital protocol with an iron fist. Dr. Carter, Dr. Randall began, his tone measured but firm. "We've been informed of yesterday's incident involving Ms. Daniels. Her passing was a tragedy, and the circumstances surrounding it have raised some serious concerns." Dr. Carter remained silent, his gaze fixed on the polished surface of the table. He felt the weight of Dr. Randall's words pressing down on him. Why wasn't her case escalated? Dr. Randall continued. Why wasn't a full cardiac workup conducted? We need answers, and we need them now. Dr. Carter swallowed hard, struggling to find his voice. I believed it was a case of anxiety," he stammered. Her symptoms were indicative of a potential cardiac event," Dr. Randall interrupted, his voice sharp. "You're one of the most experienced doctors here, Dr. Carter. We expect you to recognize these signs." There was a silence in the room, thick and suffocating. Dr. Carter's thoughts were in turmoil. The same question kept repeating in his mind. How could he have been so blind? He knew the answer, but he couldn't bring himself to admit it. Dr. Randall's expression softened slightly, but his tone remained firm. "Dr. Carter, there's going to be an internal investigation. We need to understand what went wrong, and why." The meeting ended with an air of finality. Dr. Carter left the boardroom feeling a mixture of anger, guilt, and shame. As he walked down the hallway, he couldn't escape the stares of his colleagues. Some were sympathetic, others judgmental, but all of them knew the story. It had spread quickly, as stories of failures often do. Later that day, as Dr. Carter was packing up to leave the hospital, he received an unexpected visitor. A young man with a determined expression stood at the entrance of his office. He was in his late 20s, dressed in a crisp suit, and his presence carried a weight of authority that belied his age. "Dr. Carter?" the young man asked, his voice steady. "Yes," Dr. Carter replied, trying to mask his weariness. "My name is Michael Daniels," the young man said, his eyes narrowing. "Helen Daniels was my mother." Dr. Carter felt his stomach drop. He had expected to face the family at some point, but he wasn't prepared for it to happen so soon. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. "You let her die," Michael continued, his voice trembling slightly, but his resolve unshaken. "You let my mother die because you didn't think she was worth your time. And now, you're going to answer for it." Dr. Carter felt a chill run down his spine. He wanted to explain himself, to offer some defense, but the look in Michael's eyes told him it was futile. Michael's words cut through him like a scalpel. "I've spoken to a lawyer," Michael said, his voice hardening. "There's going to be a lawsuit, Dr. Carter. You're going to be held accountable." Dr. Carter felt his heart racing. This was the beginning of a reckoning he never anticipated, and he wasn't sure he was prepared to face it. The news of Helen Daniels' death, and the impending lawsuit against Dr. Carter, spread like wildfire through Grace Medical Center and beyond. It wasn't long before local news stations got wind of the story, and soon, Helen's name and Dr. Carter's actions were being discussed on television screens across Atlanta. Public sentiment shifted quickly. Helen was no longer just a faceless patient in a hospital's records. She was a prominent figure, a well-respected civil rights attorney with a history of fighting for justice. The lawsuit, filed by Michael Daniels, claimed gross negligence on the part of Dr. Carter. It detailed Helen's symptoms, the doctor's dismissive attitude, and the missed opportunity to diagnose her condition accurately. The case was set to go to trial, and Dr. Carter found himself in the center of a media storm, his previously untarnished reputation hanging by a thread. Inside the hospital, the atmosphere had become tense. Dr. Carter could feel the judgment in the eyes of his colleagues, nurses, and even some patients. It was as if the entire institution had turned against him. He had always been a man of authority, commanding respect wherever he went, but now that respect had transformed into thinly veiled disdain. One afternoon, Dr. Carter's attorney, George Ellison, visited him at his office. George was an experienced lawyer with a sharp mind and a knack for handling high-profile medical cases. He was in his early 50s, with salt-and-pepper hair and an air of unflappable confidence that Dr. Carter had always admired. "William," George began, closing the office door behind him, "we need to talk about your defense strategy." Dr. Carter looked up from his desk, where he had been reviewing patient files in a futile attempt to distract himself. He rubbed his temples, feeling a headache beginning to form. "What's there to discuss, George?" he replied, his voice tired. "It's all over the news. Everyone has already made up their minds." George took a seat across from him, his expression serious. "It's not over until we say it's over," he said firmly. "But you need to prepare yourself. This is going to get ugly, and the prosecution is going to come at you with everything they've got." Dr. Carter sighed heavily. He had never been in a situation like this before. His entire career had been built on the foundation of excellence and success. Now, it felt like that foundation was crumbling beneath him. "George, what do I do?" Dr. Carter asked, a rare note of vulnerability in his voice. "You're going to have to testify," George replied. "You need to tell your side of the story, honestly. But more than that, you need to show the jury that you're human. If you come across as arrogant or indifferent, it's over." Dr. Carter nodded slowly. He had spent his entire career cultivating an image of authority and confidence, and now he was being asked to strip that away. He wasn't sure he knew how to do that. As the weeks passed, the pressure continued to mount. Dr. Carter found himself scrutinizing every decision he made, second-guessing his instincts, and losing sleep over what lay ahead. His confidence, once unshakable, was now riddled with self-doubt. The trial date loomed ever closer, and Dr. Carter's world seemed to shrink with each passing day. He felt as though he was trapped in a slow-motion nightmare, unable to escape the consequences of his actions. The courtroom was filled to capacity on the first day of the trial. Reporters lined the back walls, their cameras and notebooks at the ready. The gallery was packed with curious onlookers, some drawn by the notoriety of the case, others by their sympathy for Helen Daniels and her family. It was a case that had captured the city's attention, and everyone seemed to have an opinion about it. Dr. Carter sat at the defendant's table, flanked by George Ellison and his legal team. He wore a dark suit, and though he maintained a composed exterior, the tension in his jaw and the slight tremor in his hands betrayed his nerves. Across the room sat Michael Daniels, his expression steely and resolute. The sight of Michael's grief-stricken yet determined face was a stark reminder of what was at stake. As the judge entered the room, the audience quieted, and the trial officially began. The prosecution's attorney, a sharp-witted woman named Angela Reed, wasted no time in laying out the case against Dr. Carter. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Angela began, her voice clear and confident, "this case is about accountability. It's about a doctor who was entrusted with the care of a patient, and who failed that patient in her moment of need." Angela's words struck Dr. Carter like a blow. He tried to remain focused, but it was impossible not to feel the weight of her accusations. "The evidence will show," Angela continued, "that Dr. William Carter ignored clear signs of a medical emergency, that he dismissed Helen Daniels' symptoms as mere anxiety without conducting the necessary tests, and that as a result of his negligence, Helen Daniels lost her life." As Angela spoke, she gestured toward Michael Daniels, who sat silently beside her. The jury's eyes followed her every movement, their expressions a mix of curiosity and empathy. Dr. Carter felt his heart pounding in his chest. When it was George's turn to deliver the defense's opening statement, he rose from his seat and approached the jury with a measured stride. His demeanor was calm and deliberate. "Ladies and gentlemen," George began, his voice steady, "what happened to Helen Daniels was a tragedy, an undeniable and heart-wrenching tragedy. But this case is not about whether or not we grieve for her loss. We all do. It's about whether Dr. William Carter intentionally disregarded his duty as a physician, or whether this was a mistake, a human mistake, made by a man who has dedicated his life to saving others." George's words were carefully chosen, each one designed to plant a seed of doubt in the minds of the jurors. Dr. Carter listened intently, his hands clasped tightly together beneath the table. Over the next several days, the prosecution presented its case. They called a series of witnesses, including nurses who had been present during Helen's initial examination. Nurse Jessica, in particular, gave a damning testimony about Dr. Carter's dismissive attitude and his decision not to order a full cardiac workup. "He didn't listen to me," Jessica testified, her voice wavering slightly. "I told him she needed more tests, but he was confident in his diagnosis." Dr. Carter felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He knew Jessica wasn't lying. She had indeed tried to raise the alarm, and he had ignored her. Hearing her recount the events so plainly made the guilt all the more real. Then came Michael's turn to testify. He stood before the jury, his hands shaking slightly as he clutched the witness stand. His voice was heavy with emotion as he described his mother's final moments, the phone call he had received from the hospital, and the anger he felt when he learned that she had been misdiagnosed. "My mother was a fighter," Michael said, his voice cracking with grief. "She dedicated her life to helping people who were overlooked, dismissed, and mistreated. And in the end, that's exactly what happened to her." There was a collective sigh from the gallery, and Dr. Carter felt his throat tighten. Michael's words carried a painful irony that cut deeper than any accusation. When the prosecution rested its case, it was the defense's turn to present their side of the story. George called several of Dr. Carter's colleagues to the stand, each of whom spoke highly of his skills and dedication as a doctor. They testified about his years of service, the countless lives he had saved, and the respect he had earned in the medical community. But despite their praise, Dr. Carter knew that it wasn't enough. It didn't erase what had happened to Helen Daniels, and it didn't absolve him of the choices he had made that day. Finally, the moment came for Dr. Carter to take the stand. As he approached the witness box, he felt the eyes of everyone in the courtroom on him. His heart was racing, and he could feel a bead of sweat forming on his brow. "Dr. Carter," George began, his voice steady and reassuring, "can you please tell the court, in your own words, what happened the day Helen Daniels came to Grace Medical Center?" Dr. Carter took a deep breath and began to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. I made a mistake," he admitted, his eyes downcast. "I misjudged her condition, and I didn't do everything I could have to help her. And for that, I am deeply, deeply sorry." As he spoke, he felt a sense of relief wash over him. It wasn't enough to erase the guilt, but it was a start, a step toward facing the consequences of his actions. The courtroom remained silent, the tension hanging heavy in the air. Dr. Carter could only hope that, somehow, his words had made an impact on the jury, a group of 12 strangers who now held his fate in their hands.
The days leading up to the jury's deliberation were agonizing for Dr. Carter. The trial had dragged every detail of Helen Daniels' death into the public eye, and now, as he waited, he felt utterly powerless. Outside the courthouse, protesters held signs demanding justice for Helen, and news outlets continuously speculated on the outcome of the trial. Dr. Carter spent his nights replaying the events in his mind, wondering what he could have done differently. Regret consumed him. His entire career had been marked by a relentless pursuit of perfection. Yet in this case, he had fallen short. He didn't know how to reconcile that with the man he believed himself to be. When the jury finally returned to the courtroom, the air was thick with anticipation. Dr. Carter could feel his pulse pounding in his ears as he sat at the defendant's table, George by his side. The jury filed in, their faces solemn, their expressions unreadable. As the jury reached a verdict, the judge asked, his voice breaking the heavy silence. The jury foreperson stood and cleared his throat. "We have, Your Honor." Dr. Carter's hands clenched tightly together under the table. He felt as if he were on the edge of a cliff, waiting to be pushed or pulled back to safety. In the case of Michael Daniels versus Dr. William Carter, the foreperson began, "We find the defendant guilty of medical negligence." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Dr. Carter's heart sank, and he felt his vision blur momentarily. George put a steadying hand on his shoulder, but it was little comfort. The verdict wasn't entirely unexpected, yet hearing the words spoken aloud made it real in a way that nothing else had. Michael Daniels sat quietly across the room, his eyes fixed on Dr. Carter. There was no satisfaction or triumph in his gaze, only a deep sadness, and perhaps a hint of closure. The judge continued to speak, explaining the implications of the verdict, but Dr. Carter barely heard him. His thoughts were a jumble of regret and disbelief. He had known this day might come, yet he had never truly prepared himself for it. As the courtroom emptied, Dr. Carter remained seated, lost in his thoughts. The weight of the verdict pressed down on him, a heavy burden that he would carry for the rest of his life. He knew that no amount of apologies or reparations could undo what had been done, but he also knew that he had to face the consequences of his actions. The hospital board convened an emergency meeting the day after the verdict. Dr. Randall, the chief of staff, chaired the meeting with his usual air of authority, but there was a somberness in his tone that hadn't been there before. The board members were all present, their faces reflecting the gravity of the situation. Dr. Carter, Dr. Randall began, the jury has found you guilty of medical negligence in the case of Helen Daniels. The hospital's reputation has been severely damaged, and we are faced with a difficult decision. Dr. Carter sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap. He knew what was coming, and he had already resigned himself to it. The media coverage of the trial had been relentless, and the hospital couldn't afford to keep him on staff without facing backlash from the public and its benefactors. After careful consideration, Dr. Randall continued, the board has decided that you are to be relieved of your duties at Grace Medical Center, effective immediately. Your medical license will also be suspended pending further review by the state medical board. Dr. Carter nodded, accepting the decision without argument. He had expected this outcome, but hearing it spoken aloud still felt like a final blow to his already shattered career. Is there anything you'd like to say, Dr. Carter? Dr. Randall asked, his voice softer than usual. Dr. Carter hesitated for a moment. He wanted to find the right words, something that might convey his remorse. But he knew that no words could undo the damage he had caused. I'm sorry, he said simply. For everything. The room was silent, and Dr. Randall nodded curtly. You'll be given time to collect your belongings, he said, and you will be escorted off the premises by security. Dr. Carter left the boardroom in a daze, the reality of his situation sinking in. He had spent the better part of his life within the walls of Grace Medical Center, dedicating himself to the practice of medicine. And now, he was being escorted out like a criminal. As he made his way to his office for the last time, he passed by familiar faces, nurses, doctors, and staff members who had once admired him. Now, they averted their eyes, their expressions a mix of pity and disdain. Dr. Carter felt the weight of their judgment, and it only deepened his sense of isolation. When he reached his office, he found Nurse Jessica waiting outside the door. Her expression was unreadable, and for a moment, they stood in silence, neither of them knowing what to say. Jessica, Dr. Carter began, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't need an apology, Dr. Carter, she interrupted, her voice firm but not unkind. What I need is to know that you've learned something from all of this, that you won't just brush this off as another mistake. Dr. Carter felt a lump form in his throat. He had always been a man who prided himself on his knowledge and expertise. Yet here he was, being reminded of the most basic lesson of all, humility. I have, he replied, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. And I'm going to do everything I can to make things right. Jessica studied him for a moment, and then she nodded. I hope you do, she said softly, before turning and walking away. Dr. Carter entered his office and began packing up his belongings. The framed certificates and awards that had once lined his walls now seemed like hollow reminders of a past that no longer mattered. As he placed them in a box, he couldn't help but feel that they were symbols of a life spent chasing the wrong kind of success. When he finished packing, a security guard escorted him out of the building. As he stepped outside, the cool evening air hit him, and he felt an overwhelming sense of loss. The hospital had been his world, and now that world was gone. Dr. Carter stood on the steps of Grace Medical Center, looking up at the building that had once been his second home. He knew that this was not the end of his journey, but rather the beginning of a new chapter, one that would be defined not by his successes, but by his willingness to confront his failures and make amends. As he walked away from the hospital, he couldn't help but wonder what the future held. He didn't know if he would ever be able to practice medicine again, or if he would be able to rebuild his life after everything that had happened. But he knew one thing for certain: He would never forget Helen Daniels or the lesson she had taught him. Dr. Carter's life after the trial was a stark contrast to the one he had lived before. His days were no longer filled with the rigorous demands of surgery or the prestige of being a top physician. Instead, he faced an endless series of meetings with lawyers, disciplinary panels, and media inquiries. He had moved into a modest apartment on the outskirts of Atlanta, far away from the affluent neighborhood he once called home. His wife, unable to cope with the scandal and the endless pressure from the media, had filed for divorce. They had parted ways quietly, their once strong partnership dissolving into distant memories. Alone and uncertain of what to do next, Dr. Carter spent most of his time reflecting on the choices that had led him to this point. He couldn't escape the relentless guilt that gnawed at him, a constant reminder of the life he had taken and the family he had hurt. One day, as he sat in his small apartment sifting through old medical journals, outdated remnants of a life that felt increasingly distant, he received an unexpected letter in the mail. It was from a local community health clinic in one of Atlanta's underprivileged neighborhoods. The letter was an invitation from a Dr. Laura Munoz, the clinic's director, to volunteer as a consultant for their medical staff. Dr. Carter was initially taken aback by the offer. It wasn't the prestigious work he was accustomed to, and he questioned whether the clinic staff even knew who he was or what he had done. But as he read through Dr. Munoz's letter, he realized she was fully aware of his past and still believed he had something to offer. After a long night of contemplation, he decided to take the opportunity. He had nothing left to lose and, perhaps, something to gain by trying to make a difference in a place where help was truly needed. The first day at the clinic was a jarring experience for Dr. Carter. The facilities were basic, the equipment often outdated, and the staff overworked. Patients crowded into the small waiting area, many of them seeking care for chronic illnesses that had been left untreated due to a lack of resources or access to health care. Dr. Munoz greeted him with a warm smile, extending her hand. She was a petite woman in her late 40s, with curly hair pulled back into a loose bun and eyes that radiated kindness. "Thank you for coming, Dr. Carter," she said, her voice genuinely appreciative. "I know this is a big step for you." Dr. Carter wasn't used to such open displays of gratitude, and he felt an unexpected wave of emotion. He nodded stiffly, unsure of how to respond. "I won't lie," Dr. Munoz continued, "this isn't going to be easy. We're short-staffed and underfunded, and the patients here often come to us as a last resort. But they need help, and I believe you can provide it." Dr. Carter spent the next few weeks slowly acclimating to his new surroundings. He started by reviewing patient files, offering his insights and guidance to the clinic's younger doctors. Many of the cases reminded him of the very patients he had once dismissed as routine. But now, he saw them with different eyes that had been opened by his failures. As time passed, Dr. Carter began to find a sense of purpose at the clinic. He couldn't erase what had happened to Helen Daniels, but he could use his skills to help those who needed it most. He threw himself into the work, spending long hours at the clinic and even staying late into the night to catch up on patient charts and treatment plans. One day, as he was finishing up a consultation, Dr. Munoz approached him with a thoughtful expression. "William," she said, using his first name, a familiarity that had slowly developed between them, "there's something I need to discuss with you." Dr. Carter looked up from the chart he was reviewing. "What is it?" he asked, sensing the gravity in her voice. Dr. Munoz handed him a folded piece of paper. "Michael Daniels reached out to the clinic. He wants to speak with you." Dr. Carter's heart stopped. He hadn't spoken to Michael since the trial, and he had assumed that any chance for reconciliation was long gone. He unfolded the paper, which contained Michael's phone number and a brief note. "We need to talk." For several days, Dr. Carter agonized over whether to make the call. Part of him wanted to avoid the confrontation, to continue his new life without reopening old wounds. But he knew that wasn't an option. He owed Michael an apology, even if it wasn't enough to heal the pain he had caused. When he finally dialed the number, his hands were shaking. The phone rang several times before a familiar voice answered. "Hello." Michael's voice was cautious, guarded. "Michael, it's Dr. Carter," he said, his voice faltering. He wasn't sure if he even had the right to call himself a doctor anymore. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Dr. Carter held his breath, waiting for Michael to respond. "What do you want?" Michael finally asked, his tone cold and detached. "I want to meet with you," Dr. Carter said, forcing himself to keep his voice steady. "I owe you an apology and an explanation." Michael didn't respond right away. Dr. Carter could hear the sound of traffic in the background, and he imagined Michael standing on a busy street, considering whether to give him a second chance. "All right," Michael said at last, his voice barely audible. "But this is your only chance. Don't waste it." They agreed to meet at a small cafe on the outskirts of the city. Dr. Carter arrived early, feeling an uneasy mixture of dread and hope. He didn't know what to expect from the conversation, but he knew it was something he had to face. When Michael arrived, he was dressed in a simple jacket and jeans, his face expressionless as he approached the table. He sat down without a word, folding his arms across his chest. "Thank you for meeting with me," Dr. Carter began, his voice heavy with emotion. "I know you probably don't want to hear anything I have to say, but I need you to know how deeply sorry I am for what happened to your mother." Michael stared at him, his eyes hard and unyielding. "Sorry," he echoed bitterly. "Do you really think an apology is going to change anything?" "No," Dr. Carter admitted, his voice breaking. "I know it won't, but I can't live with myself if I don't try to make amends, in whatever small way I can." For the next hour, Dr. Carter spoke openly about his failures and his regrets. He didn't make excuses or try to justify his actions. Instead, he acknowledged his arrogance and the biases that had clouded his judgment. He told Michael about the time he had spent at the clinic, trying to atone for his mistakes by helping others in need. Michael listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When Dr. Carter finished, he took a deep breath and waited for Michael to respond. "You know," Michael said quietly, "my mother dedicated her life to fighting for people who didn't have a voice. People like the patients you're helping now." Dr. Carter nodded, feeling a lump rise in his throat. "I can't forgive you," Michael continued, his voice trembling with emotion. "Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I can see that you're trying to change, and that means something." Dr. Carter felt a tear slide down his cheek, and he didn't try to wipe it away. He knew that forgiveness was not something he could demand or expect. It was something he would have to earn, one day at a time. As Michael stood to leave, he paused and looked back at Dr. Carter. "Just don't let this be another mistake," he said softly before walking out of the cafe. Dr. Carter sat alone at the table, the weight of Michael's words lingering in the air. He knew that he still had a long way to go, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope. Dr. Carter's life had taken an unexpected turn, and his journey toward redemption was slow and fraught with challenges. At the community clinic, he found solace in the work and in the relationships he was slowly rebuilding. Dr. Munoz continued to mentor him, and the staff, initially wary of his presence, began to see that he was committed to making a difference. Word spread among the clinic's patients about the older doctor who had once been disgraced, but was now trying to do right by those in need. Some were skeptical, while others saw him as a man who had lost everything and was fighting to rebuild something meaningful. One day, a new patient came into the clinic, a young mother named Tamika, who had been struggling with undiagnosed health issues for years. Dr. Carter reviewed her symptoms carefully, recognizing similarities to cases he had handled in the past. He ordered a series of tests and discovered that Tamika had a rare but treatable cardiac condition. His swift diagnosis saved her life, and she expressed her gratitude with tears in her eyes. Dr. Carter felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. The feeling of helping someone brought back a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time, but it also served as a stark reminder of the mistakes that had cost Helen Daniels her life. He couldn't escape the memory, but he used it to drive him forward, ensuring that he never dismissed another patient's symptoms or cries for help. Dr. Munoz noticed the change in Dr. Carter's demeanor. One evening, as they were locking up the clinic, she turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "You've come a long way, William," she said, "but you need to stop punishing yourself for what happened. Helen Daniels' death was a tragedy, but you've been given a second chance to do something meaningful. Don't waste it." Dr. Carter nodded, knowing she was right. The self-imposed guilt he carried would never completely fade, but he could no longer allow it to paralyze him. If he was to honor Helen's memory, He needed to continue moving forward and making a difference where he could. Several months later, Dr. Carter received another unexpected message, this time from Michael Daniels. It was brief, a simple invitation to attend a memorial service for Helen, to be held in the city's historic Ebenezer Baptist Church. Dr. Carter wasn't sure if he was ready to face Helen's family again, but he knew he had to go. It was a chance to pay his respects and perhaps take another step toward closure. On the day of the service, the church was filled with people whose lives Helen had touched. Community leaders, civil rights activists, friends, and family members all gathered to honor her legacy. As Dr. Carter entered the church, he felt a wave of anxiety wash over him. He hadn't been in a place like this in a long time, surrounded by people who still carried the pain of his mistake. He found a seat in the back, trying to remain inconspicuous. The service began, with speakers sharing stories of Helen's courage, her dedication to justice, and her unwavering compassion for those in need. Dr. Carter listened quietly, absorbing every word. When Michael took the podium, there was a moment of silence as he collected his thoughts. His voice was steady as he spoke about his mother's work, her commitment to fighting for equality, and her belief that everyone deserved a second chance. Michael's eyes scanned the room, and for a moment, they rested on Dr. Carter. There was no animosity in his gaze, only a quiet acceptance of the reality they both shared. "My mother always believed in redemption," Michael said, his voice filled with emotion. "She believed that people could change, even when they had made terrible mistakes. I don't know if I'm there yet, but I'm trying to honor her memory by holding on to that belief." Dr. Carter felt a lump form in his throat. He knew that Michael's words were not just about his mother. They were a message to him as well. After the service, people slowly began to leave the church. Dr. Carter remained seated, waiting for the crowd to thin before making his way to the front of the sanctuary. He approached Helen's memorial photo, a beautiful portrait that captured her strength and warmth. "I'm so sorry," Dr. Carter whispered, his voice barely audible. He wasn't sure if he was speaking to Helen's memory or to himself. As he turned to leave, he saw Michael standing nearby. There was a moment of hesitation before Michael approached him. "I wasn't sure you would come," Michael said quietly. "I wasn't sure I deserved to," Dr. Carter replied, his voice heavy with regret. Michael was silent for a moment. Then he let out a sigh. "You're here. That means something." They stood in silence for a while, neither knowing what to say. It wasn't a reconciliation, and it wasn't forgiveness, but it was a beginning, an acknowledgement that they were both trying to move forward in their own ways. "I'm going to keep working at the clinic," Dr. Carter said, feeling the need to share his intention. "I want to keep helping people, the way your mother did." Michael nodded. "That's good," he replied. "She would have wanted that." As they parted ways, Dr. Carter felt a sense of relief, knowing that he had taken another small step toward healing. He would never be able to erase the past, but he could honor Helen's legacy by dedicating his life to serving others and striving to be the kind of doctor and the kind of person who listened, cared, and took every patient's needs seriously. Over time, Dr. Carter's work at the clinic became more than just a means of redemption. It became his life's calling. He found a renewed sense of purpose in serving the community, and he forged new relationships built on trust and compassion. The clinic grew, gaining support from donors and volunteers inspired by the story of a disgraced doctor trying to make amends. Dr. Carter never sought to reclaim his old life or return to the prestigious halls of Grace Medical Center. Instead, he chose to devote himself to the work that truly mattered, embracing the humility and empathy he had once lacked. In the end, Dr. William Carter didn't become the man he had once aspired to be. He became something else, something better. And as he stood outside the clinic one evening, watching the sunset over the city, he felt a quiet peace settle over him. He had found his way, not by erasing his past, but by learning from it and using it to forge a new path forward.